Hello and welcome to What's Cooking at Acquis. What's Cooking is a monthly podcast series dedicated to delivering EU developments, news, book reviews, and discussions surrounding culture and gastronomy, as well as sessions with surprise guests. This podcast is brought to you by Acquis EU Law Policy, an independent international partnership established on the doorsteps of the EU institutions in Brussels that offers EU legal, regulatory, and policy services for diplomatic and private sector clients. If you'd like to learn more about Acquis EU Law Policy, please visit our website at www.acquislp.eu. That's www.acquislp.eu. So this is episode 1 of the Acquis podcast, which is aptly named Cybersecurity and Launch. So I think it is appropriate to briefly introduce ourselves as the team behind Acquis EU Law Policy. Jeroen Jansen, you are founder and managing partner. Can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Thank you, Alexander, and happy to be on this show. I'm a lawyer by education, graduated from the University of Maastricht, specialized in EU law and public international law. I started my career in the Dutch diplomatic service straight after university and had mainly postings in the area of multilateral diplomacy. I held positions at the departments and diplomatic missions at the UN, in New York as well as in Geneva, the European Union, a lot of council work and working groups in Brussels, and was posted also to the delegation and subsequent mission to the OSCE in Vienna. Over the years, I dealt extensively with sanctions and sanctions compliance and enforcement. And in the early years of my career, it was related mainly to the cases of Iraq, Iran, the former Yugoslavia, Libya, and more recently, of course, Iran and Russia as top items in our portfolio. I served in various special missions, mostly in crisis areas and conflict zones. And as a break from all the excitement, also took a secondment as national expert with the European Commission. My last full diplomatic post at the time was in Beirut, in Lebanon, as deputy ambassador of the, of course, Dutch embassy. And after a stopover in the energy sector following my diplomatic career, I led for 13 years the EU regulatory and government affairs team of a leading international law firm here in Brussels before establishing Acquis in the spring of 2020. Valerius, co-founding partner at Acquis. A few words about your early days.
Yeah, hi, my name is Valerius Ostrovskis. I'm a lawyer from Lithuania. I have my educational background is the law faculty of the university in Vilnius, which I beefed up by studies in law and economics in the University of Rotterdam and Bologna. I started my career as a hardcore litigation lawyer in Lithuania, but after some time I realized that I was more attracted by EU law and policy, and therefore for the last 12 years I have been practicing in this area in Brussels. The last 8 years or so, I have been very much focused on EU sanctions and export control, which is a very exciting area. And this is the practice I'm co-heading in the Acquis.
Laura, a few words.
Thank you, Jeroen. My name is Laura Zemmler. I'm a senior EU policy advisor at Acquis. I'm originally from Germany, got interested in international politics during a high school year in the US, then went on to study international relations and governance and public policy in Passau and Frankfurt in Germany with the stint to Sciences Po Lyon, with a focus on EU external relations. And this is also how I started my career. I started with different internships at the German Foreign Service, Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation. Noticed early on that I liked the Brussels environment and EU external affairs. And then started my professional career as an EU policy advisor in the EU regulatory and government affairs practice of a large international law firm in Brussels, and always focusing on diplomatic services. From the beginning of my time in Brussels, I focused on providing diplomatic support services to foreign government clients. Also went on a secondment to a Brussels embassy of a prominent Gulf state. And in my service to corporations and associations, I mainly focused on digital and tech.
Alexander Lomans.
Yes, I'm Alexander. I have a background in finance from Syracuse University, where I got my bachelor's degree. And then I moved on to King's College London, where I pursued a master's in Eurasian political economy and energy at the Russia Institute. And in my capacity at Acquis EU Law Policy, I work as a policy advisor, and I also work on the company's business development initiatives.
Thank you, Alexander. In the next episodes, we will also introduce our affiliated partners and colleagues from Explico Acquis, based in Central and Eastern Europe, as well as our other affiliations throughout the European Union and in the United States. Focus, of course, on Washington, D.C. Thank you very much, Alexander, for the introduction.
Yes, and with that, you have a good picture of our Brussels team. As Jeroen said, we also operate with our partners and affiliates, which I hope you will talk maybe a bit about in the context of the following question, which is, Jeroen, why did you launch Acquis?
Well, thank you, Alexander. If you have a plan, if you are entrepreneurial, have an independent mindset, are good at team building and convinced that your expertise and that of the wider team is in demand, you just start a company and you just do it. And that's what we did.
It's a good answer. And then Valerius, a good amount of us, we moved together from a large platform. What do you see as the benefits for a boutique setup that drove us to move to the Acquis project?
The boutique setup in comparison to a big law firm, it gives you more freedom and more drive to deliver better services to clients and also become better professionally. You are challenged every day. You are forced to think more creatively, and you are much more agile in responding to clients' demands. You are better fit to tailor your offering to the best interest of the client. So for me, it was both driven by client demands and the willingness to serve clients better, but also as a personal challenge driven by my entrepreneurial spirit, as Jeroen has mentioned too.
And I think also don't underestimate the cost factor. I think that the boutique firm that we decided to establish consciously choose for a relatively low overhead, which is something that many of the big international firms, of course, cannot afford themselves. I mean, they need big buildings, they need a receptionist, and all the bells and whistles. And many of our clients have always said, do we really need this marble foyer with someone that sits nicely behind a desk to welcome you? I mean, I'm not being facetious, but there is an element of cost effectiveness as well, which you then can pass on to the clients that of course appreciate the quality of services, but are also businesses in most cases themselves. So the price-quality ratio is also positively influenced with the agility of the approach and the services that we provide. There's another important element that distinguishes a boutique from a big international firm, and that is that it is easier to navigate and avoid conflicts of interest, and it is also easier to navigate as lawyers. You want to represent interests of clients. In big law, you sometimes cannot represent a particular client because of a do not act for or other restrictions. Sometimes politically exposed persons, although they have a case that would be completely legitimate to take on or to defend, for reputational or other reasons, big firms tend to be, let's say risk averse, or at least to be a bit more mindful of those kind of considerations, and sometimes for the wrong reasons. So in that sense, I also believe that being independent is having certain additional benefits. Very good afternoon. We're extremely pleased and quasi-privileged, I would say, to have Ambassador Timo Koster with us this afternoon to speak on the topic of cybersecurity and cybersecurity policy. Ambassador Koster joined the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs after earning his law degree from the University of Amsterdam. I thought you were a Leiden man.
First mistake of the afternoon.
That is a serious hiccup in our preparations. And following his law degree, he started his career at the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs with diplomatic postings in, among other places, Nairobi, London, and Athens. In Athens, he was appointed the deputy ambassador. And he also served subsequently at NATO as the Director for Defense Policy and Capabilities. He is also a fellow at the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, and currently the Ambassador at Large of the Kingdom of the Netherlands for Security Policy and Cyber. Timo, it's a great pleasure to welcome you on our podcast show. We hear a lot about cybercrime, cyber warfare, but what is it that we actually should talk about? What we actually should be worried about? What matters most, and what do we mean by cybersecurity conceptually?
Jeroen, thank you very much. First of all, thank you, Acquis, and thank you, Jeroen Jansen, for having me this afternoon. It's a great opportunity to talk about the things that we care about in the Netherlands. When you talk about cybersecurity, there's basically three categories of threats and challenges that we distinguish. First of all, it's state actors that tend to attack our infrastructure, try to, in some cases, steal our intellectual property, sometimes directly, sometimes through proxies. Secondly, criminals that either try to distort money from you or rob banks, etc. And then thirdly, terrorists that try to disseminate content and recruit through the internet. And these three categories pose us with significant challenges because it's so far a fairly lawless environment where we are really struggling to get a grip on.
Just forgive me my ignorance, but we come across sometimes NGOs in the European theater of policy operations where we assume that they provide disinformation or false facts to influence policy and decision making. And in fact, these NGOs in many cases are well established. I mean, proper organizations. Would you count them as part of one of the categories?
Well, disinfo again is a different issue, which is not necessarily a cyber challenge per se, because you can spread disinfo through many different channels. You can do it through the newspaper, on websites, but also through cyber means. But that's a problem in itself, and we've got NGOs that at least pose as non-governmental organizations, but sometimes are actually the long arm of some states that actually mean harm.
Yeah, the state actors. You are not mentioning any particular names, but is there a pattern? Is there a more, let's say, global concern about specific actors? And are there others aspiring to learn? Because compared, let's take the label cyber warfare. Of course, it is less costly and less complex, also in terms of human resources. Do you think this could be, if we do not have the right policy instruments in place, this could mushroom into something also for other, let's say, more weaker and more modest states in terms of military history?
Absolutely. I think when you talk about military means, cyber is what I would call the great equalizer. A cyber weapon is much cheaper than a tank or a fighter jet. So if you want to do harm to another country, probably at this moment a cyber weapon is the cheapest way to get yourself in the game. And that's actually a serious concern for countries like the Netherlands, but also for organizations like NATO. You deal with relatively small players that can do a lot of harm, not only harm directed at specific targets, but also collateral damage that might derive from attacks that are meant to impact somewhere else, but it can actually hit you on the side.
When you look at the instruments that the state actors, other actors use, the internet plays an important role, I reckon. Is there any vision or view on the role of internet service providers in the cyber sphere or the cybersecurity sphere?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I talked earlier about the internet as a lawless place. It's not entirely lawless, but one of the main priorities of the government of the Netherlands is to contribute to setting the rules of the road in cyberspace. So in other words, the internet is not owned by the government. It's owned by everyone, so it's basically owned by nobody.
It's owned by nobody, no.
Indeed, but you need a multi-stakeholder approach to setting the rules of the road, which means government, the private sector and civil society, NGOs, the Red Cross, human rights organizations, etc. And you have to, between those actors, you have to agree certain norms, certain rules, and then you have to, that's the second priority, get the different actors to adhere to those rules, which is very difficult.
Yeah, which is of course also alluding to the issue of enforcement of these rules. Now, the Netherlands has a very special role to play, I think, if you look at the constitutional obligation to promote international law and order, legal order, to promote the legal order and promote international law and a rule-based international system. Is this something that the Netherlands has been, with also your role as ambassador at large for cyber and security, has been able to bring across the message of regulation and good policy? You were also speaking to the UN Security Council last month in, I think it was April, if I'm not mistaken, April 2020. Or was it May?
Yeah, I think it was in May, yeah.
In May, still fresh. Does this Dutch approach get traction?
Yeah.
And what's the importance?
So what you mentioned is really important because the principle that is enshrined in Article 90 of the Dutch Constitution, which says the government is obliged to promote and uphold the international rules-based order, that's for us the starting point. So we believe that cyberspace should be governed by international law just like the real world, so to speak. And that's for us the starting point when we talk to other nations about what the rules of the road are. So when I addressed the UN Security Council a month ago, basically I made 3 points. One is our focus is on establishing those rules of the road. We've got norms that already are established. For example, don't attack the public core of the internet, don't attack health infrastructure, which is very topical at this moment during this crisis.
Only health or also other
No,
critical infrastructure?
Other
Because-
critical infrastructure, but also electoral infrastructure, which is also very topical if you look at the United States, for example. Second priority for us is increase the chance of catching the bad guys, which means that we have to work together between nations to do attribution of state actors attacking other state actors. That we have an EU diplomatic toolbox, a sanctions regime in place now.
Which was a Dutch initiative, if I'm not
Which was
mistaken.
indeed a Dutch initiative, that's true.
Can you briefly summarize what the initiative was?
I'll go into that in a moment.
Okay,
But the third very important priority when I addressed the UN Security Council is about equipping weaker weaker nations to protect themselves and defend themselves. This is about resilience and capacity building, which is basically development aid in cyberspace. Capacity building is really one of the spearheads for the Netherlands. We have established an organization that's called the Global Forum for Cyber Expertise, where we make sure that the resilience of less developed cyber countries are basically brought up to a certain level. And you might think about the Global South, you might think about Africa when I say this, but it's actually even EU countries that are still not equipped well enough. Take a country like Cyprus, for example.
Yeah. To come back to the European Union and the EU member states, interesting that you say that not even in Europe we are on the same page. There's no level playing field when it comes to capabilities, defense against cybercrime and cyber attacks. How would you rate the European cyber policy as it stands currently? And not to criticize, but to see where we can actually work towards an improvement. What would be the key upgrades, if you wish, of that policy?
So I don't think you can say that there is a EU cyber policy per se. There's a couple of areas where the EU is involved. For example, where we look at attacks, we have a diplomatic toolbox now that we can actually bring to bear in cases where nations get attacked. We have a EU cyber sanctions regime, which can actually impose sanctions not so much on nations but on individuals and entities.
Which was a Dutch initiative.
Which was a Dutch initiative, which was agreed more than a year ago, but to be frank, it hasn't been applied yet. We haven't imposed any sanctions yet, but we're in the process of agreeing the first batch of sanctions, which is not easy because you have to agree with 27 member states.
But there's process involved as well. I mean, you have to investigate, you have to document, you have to prove, and if you're proven wrong with the application of these sanctions measures, you could be challenged even in the European courts.
Exactly. Courts. So you don't want to get it wrong, one. Secondly, everything you put on the table in terms of evidence has to be unclassified, which is not easy because some of the evidence that you gather comes from our security services, from our police services, etc. But if it's not unclassified, you cannot share it with other member states, one, and second, you cannot submit it to the European Court of Justice. So that's a very important condition. But we're in the process of agreeing that first batch of sanctions, and I hope you will be able to see those sanctions come out in the next couple of months. But so back to, does the EU have an overall cyber policy? No, it doesn't, but we're working on several aspects of it.
Is there also not the complexity of mandates and prerogatives, whereby the EU has a particular type of mandate or a limited mandate, where NATO is involved, where the member states individually are involved? We have, of course, the group of Five Eyes, countries that share intelligence and data, that worry about other things. It's quite a mix of stakeholders. Do you believe that there's enough international coordination in order to arrive at concerted and very targeted, refined effort? Because it seems to me that is what you need when it comes to fighting cybercrime or even going to cyber warfare.
Yeah, so first of all, let me say that this is a fairly new area. If you compare to what the internal market is about, that's been in place for decades, and this area of cyber is a matter of the past couple of years that we're developing. And it's probably not going fast enough, but we're getting there. I'm a strong believer in multilateralism. So I believe that we should organize our defense through NATO, and I think we should organize let's say our markets through the EU. But in terms of cyber, it's of limited value to stick to one regional organization, because cyber is like climate change. It doesn't stop at the border of Austria, and Austria is not a member of the EU, so they're not affected. No, we have to look bigger. So I think the place to make arrangements about the rules of the road in cyberspace is the UN. We coordinate through the EU what our position is within the UN. But of course, there's 193 nations, and we've got two parallel negotiating tracks ongoing in the UN to establish those norms and rules. And that's a long-term endeavor. I mean, look at any other domain. Let's say the law of the high seas, UNCLOS.
Yeah.
Took decades.
I know that very well. I mean, it took decades from Grotius and his thesis to 1994 when the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea was signed. And then it wasn't ratified. It wasn't not even ratified. It did not even enter into force. But
that's right.
The problem is that,
and what people don't seem to remember is that the UNCLOS treaty only entered into force in 1983, after 500 years of sailing the high seas.
Yeah, that's
and
correct.
By the way, it wasn't agreed by Russia and wasn't ratified by the United States.
As a lawyer, I don't want to interrupt you because we're civilized and polite.
You just did.
The issue with the Law of the Sea Convention is that most of it was a codification of customary international law. And of course, the issue with cyber war and warfare security and with cyber as a theme is that there is no legal precedent in exactly this sphere. So we have to find parallels or examples that would be similar to this.
Well, so this is where we might disagree. At least the position of the Netherlands and most of our like-minded countries is that international law and international humanitarian law applies in full in cyberspace.
I agree.
So the UN Charter, the right of self-defense, the definition of armed conflict, all those kind of legally
state responsibility
defined,
as well.
Yeah. So for instance, state responsibility is defined in a more precise way for cyberspace. But we believe that international law and international humanitarian law applies in full in cyberspace. So we differ in that field with countries like Russia and China, who believe that they don't apply in full and that we need a separate treaty and a separate legal instrument to regulate.
When it comes to principles of customary international law, and when it comes to general principles of law, international law included, I think it all applies. But at the same time, there are new elements, of course, and there is a risk also of impunity of, take in particular the non-state actors, the NGOs, the puppets, the trolls. I think that is something that will complicate this file tremendously. And I'm not going to draw the parallel to the International Criminal Court, where you have similar concerns about getting to individuals, and are these individuals really state actors or members of the military, or are they guerrillas or loose and lonely wolves operating by themselves? Final question, because we're running out of time. What does the future hold without an S? And are we ready and should we be prepared to establish a European cyber army?
So what does the future hold? I think the present and the near future will hold more insecurity, more unexpected events. Look at the way the COVID-19 crisis has developed into a cyber event, a cyber crisis in itself.
Indeed, even the Commission was issuing a special report on disinformation during the COVID crisis that was used by both state and non-state actors, I must add, to stir up trouble and commotion.
So it's being used in terms of using emails with infected links with a label COVID-19 that people might click on. It's being used to spread disinformation. It's being used to try and steal pharmaceutical solutions of companies that are developing a vaccine, etc. So we will see more of that for sure. And every new unexpected crisis or event might have its cyber dimension. At the same time, I think we are making good progress in terms of regulating that domain, agreeing between civilized nations what is and what is not acceptable, and like I said, raising the chance that we can catch the bad guys and impose consequences. That means call them out, naming and shaming,
and
sanctions, and so on. So. We're not there yet. It's a new domain. It's difficult. It's like when we started in this First World War, where chemical weapons were completely accepted. Now we're 100 years on, and we have an OPCW and rules and norms that prohibit the use of chemical weapons. In the Second World War, indiscriminate bombing of civilian populations. That doesn't happen anymore. And I think that we will develop towards a worldwide accepted regime in cyberspace as well.
But we have to hurry because we don't have the same timeline available to our objectives to stop this or to counter this, for the simple reason that the price of an average computer and a server is, of course, much lower, both in terms of procurement as well as in effort, when you compare to weapons technology during the Second and the First World War. So I think this is more prominent and urgent than ever, and let's hope that we can proceed and also identify and prosecute those that are responsible for this. Interestingly enough, when you go back to the Security Council, when you speak to the Security Council, you know that several countries around the table are far advanced in using the cyber instrument and others are not. I think that the European Union could make a real difference, this is my personal opinion, in empowering the weaker nations and its partners in its development programs. Weaker as in terms of less internet and technology savvy and sophisticated, to prepare a better defense. For cyber.
So that's absolutely true, and offense is easier and cheaper in cyberspace than defense. That's why I called it the great equalizer. That's absolutely true. I think we're on the right path to determining what is and what is not acceptable. We know that certain nations have cyber means at their disposal. The Netherlands has come out and said in public that we have offensive cyber weapons in our defense organization. It's not so much whether you have them or not, it's actually under which circumstances would you employ them. And that's something that we need to agree and regulate. And you're absolutely right, we're in a hurry, and that's why a country like the Netherlands has an ambassador for cyber.
Well, we have in our library, we have several books on the rules of warfare, humanitarian law. Cyber does not yet. Has a place in those scholarly works, but they soon will have. Timo Koster, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. We will stay tuned and hopefully also next time spend a bit more time with other experts and guests on sanctions in relation to cybercrime and cyber issues. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. I enjoyed being with you.
Ambassador Koster, thank you very much.
We hope you enjoyed episode 1 of the Acquis EU Law and Policy podcast. We hope you will join us again next month for the second edition, and thank you for listening.